In 1945, 25 pacifists walked into a psychiatric hospital on the banks of the Hudson River. They had refused to fight in the war. The government sent them to work as attendants instead, the lowest job in the building. What they found on the wards was staff beating patients for sport, dozens of men packed into rooms with nothing but wooden benches, and doctors who spent less than a minute per patient on rounds. The country called these men cowards. They were the only ones who spoke up. But to understand what they walked into, you have to go back almost 80 years, to when this hospital was built on land that belonged to one of the most powerful families in America. In 1867, the state of New York was looking for a place to build a new psychiatric hospital. The existing asylum in Utica was overflowing, and investigators had found mentally ill people chained in poorhouse basements across the state. A railroad executive named James Roosevelt offered to sell his country estate in Poughkeepsie, a 200-acre property overlooking the Hudson River. The state accepted. Roosevelt moved his family north to Hyde Park. 15 years later, his son Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born there. The land the father gave up would become a hospital. The son would become the 32nd president. New York had a specific vision for this place. It would not be called an asylum. That word carried too much weight, too many images of chains and locked doors. This would be a hospital. The distinction was deliberate. The building that rose on Roosevelt's land was designed to be beautiful because beauty was the treatment. Stained glass windows in the vestibule, gardens and walking paths laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux across 2/3 of the property. It was meant to prove that the right surroundings could quiet a troubled mind. The construction was a disaster, and one detail tells you everything you need to know about the people running it. $30,000 was spent blasting rocks from the bottom of a reservoir on the hospital grounds. The superintendent's explanation was that if patients went missing, staff might need to rake the bottom for bodies and the rocks would get in the way. That was the level of care being planned for the living. Costs had exploded past the original budget. The building was never completed. And when the state investigated in 1893, its conclusion was blunt. The institution had been grossly mismanaged. The superintendent resigned, leaving behind overcrowded wards, a half-finished building, and contracts that had been bled for decades. Into that wreckage walked Dr. Charles W. Pilgrim. He arrived from the Willard Asylum and began dismantling the old system immediately. He abolished mechanical restraint at a time when straitjackets and locking cribs were standard tools at institutions across the country. He found work for the majority of patients and turned the campus into a self-contained village with its own farms, post office, and fire department. When New York later built a massive new psychiatric hospital on Long Island, they named it after him. Pilgrim State Hospital would become the largest psychiatric institution in the world. Its namesake got his start in Poughkeepsie. But even Pilgrim could not outrun the numbers. The hospital had been designed for roughly 600 patients. By the 1940s, it held approximately 6,000. Dining rooms were converted into dormitories. Individual rooms became group wards. The phrase, "send them to Poughkeepsie," became shorthand across the region for committing someone to a mental hospital. A 10-story building opened in 1952 specifically to absorb the overflow. It was not enough. The institution that had been designed to heal through beauty and open space was now a warehouse. The gardens were still there, but nobody had time to walk through them. If there is a part of this story you think the state of New York would most want you to forget, tell me which one in the comments. That was the hospital. The 25 conscientious objectors walked into in April of 1945. They were mostly Mennonites. Under the Civilian Public Service Program, men who refused military service on religious grounds were assigned to work of national importance as an alternative to combat. At Hudson River, they were assigned as attendants on the wards. It was the hardest, lowest paid work in the building, the job nobody else wanted. and it put them closer to the patients than anyone else in the institution. What they found was a hospital that had long since abandoned the principles it was built on. Wards designed for individual rooms now held dozens of patients with nothing but wooden benches to sit on. Window panes were broken, letting cold air pour into rooms where men sat in insufficient clothing. Physicians moved through the wards so quickly that individual patients received less than a minute of attention on rounds. There were no routine tuberculosis screenings. The stained glass and the gardens and the vision of healing through beauty might as well have belonged to a different building. But the worst of it was on Ryan Hall. Ryan Hall sat at the far southern edge of the property. It was as far from the administration building as you could get, and the distance was not accidental. This was where the hospital sent its most violent and criminally committed patients. The wards were overcrowded, the staff were undertrained, and some of the attendants had discovered that nobody was watching. The conscientious objectors found attendants on Ryan Hall who tormented patients for their own amusement. One conscientious objector later described what he saw. On one ward in particular, the disturbed ward, the violent ward as they sometimes called it, there was extensive abuse of patients. They would torment the patients and get a big kick out of it. These were not isolated incidents. This was the culture of the ward. The people hired to care for the most vulnerable patients in the building had turned cruelty into entertainment, and they did it because they knew nobody would stop them. This was not new. The institution had a long history of failing its patients in ways the outside world never saw. There is a story from the hospital's early years that has never been fully verified but has persisted in local accounts for over a century. A Poughkeepsie actress named Margaret Shane was committed around 1917 for what was described as overwork. Shortly after arriving, she swallowed a knife from the dining table. The staff dismissed it. 3 years later, surgery revealed she had swallowed additional silverware over that entire period. She died shortly after. Whether every detail of this account is accurate or partly legend, the core of it points to something the conscientious objectors would recognize decades later. A woman in distress, sending the most desperate signal imaginable, and nobody paying attention for years. 20 years after Shane's death, the indifference had turned lethal. In 1937, an attendant named Vincent Curry attacked a 58-year-old patient named Alexis St. Pierre. Curry punched him. He knocked him to the floor. Then he kicked him in the stomach over and over until the man stopped moving. St. Pierre died from his injuries. The killing was not hidden. Curry was arrested, brought to trial, and charged. He was convicted of a misdemeanor. He served approximately 1 year in a county jail. Then he walked out. That was the value the state of New York placed on the life of a psychiatric patient in 1937. And 8 years after that, the conscientious objectors arrived on those same wards to find that nothing had fundamentally changed. They decided they could not stay quiet. Some of them went to their camp director first, then to the hospital's personnel director, then straight to the superintendent, Dr. John R. Ross. Ross had suspected the abuse for years, but he had never been able to get evidence he could act on. Now he had witnesses willing to testify. Dr. Ross fired 4 attendants immediately, but the conscientious objectors wanted more than internal discipline. J. Willard Lynchide, one of the objectors stationed at Hudson River, put it simply. He said they were all fired with a desire to expose mental hospital conditions to the general public, in the hope that such an expose would lead to action toward the improvement of such institutions. What happened next is something no one could have predicted. On July 9, 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Hudson River State Hospital. She came at the invitation of Edna Ramsier, a Bluffton College professor who was leading the conscientious objector unit. 2 days later, in her nationally syndicated column My Day, Roosevelt wrote about what she had seen. Roosevelt wrote that the superintendent of the hospital told her that they had undoubtedly raised the standards for the care of patients, and that they had been of tremendous help in disclosing certain practices which existed there, and about which he never before could get any real evidence. Think about this for a moment. The land beneath Eleanor Roosevelt's feet had been sold to the state by James Roosevelt, her husband's father, 78 years earlier. The family that gave this land to New York so that the state could build a hospital to heal the mentally ill was now, 3 generations later, bearing witness to the fact that the hospital had become the opposite of what it was built to be. The conscientious objectors did not stop at Hudson River. Across the country, conscientious objectors working in state institutions documented what they found and pushed it into public view. Their efforts led to the founding of the National Mental Health Foundation in 1946. 2 years later, journalist Albert Deutsch published The Shame of the States, a book that compared conditions in American psychiatric hospitals to what Allied soldiers had found in Nazi concentration camps. The men who refused to fight in the war had started a different one. For a brief period in the late 1950s, it looked like the fight might be won. New medications made it possible to unlock the wards. By 1960, 90% of the doors at Hudson River stood open. The hospital began treating psychosis on an outpatient basis, years ahead of federal policy. For the first time since Pilgrim's era, the building seemed to be doing what it was designed to do. It did not last. In 1950, 30% of the entire New York state budget had gone to mental hospitals. Politicians decided that was unsustainable. Over the next 3 decades, the state emptied its psychiatric wards. Patients were discharged into communities that had no services waiting for them. In 2002, Governor Pataki vetoed the one law that had required savings from closing hospital beds to be spent on community alternatives. The safety net was cut and the money disappeared. At Hudson River, the population fell from 6,000 to fewer than 600. Wings closed because the floors had collapsed from neglect. On January 25, 2012, the last 15 patients were transferred to Rockland Psychiatric Center in Orangeburg, New York. 141 years of continuous operation ended with a quiet bus ride down the highway. The campus sat vacant. Vandals smashed windows. Copper thieves stripped wiring from the walls. In 2007, a lightning strike set fire to the south wing in one of the worst fires in Dutchess County history. More fires followed in 2010 and in 2018. The 2018 fire was confirmed as arson. Walmart expressed interest in the property. The town board said no. A developer eventually purchased 156 acres for $4 million. Only 6 of roughly 59 original buildings are being preserved. The Cheney building, 12 stories tall, was demolished and its concrete crushed for reuse on site. Ryan Hall, where attendants beat patients for their own entertainment, is gone. The southern portion of the property is now a retail development with a ShopRite supermarket, a CVS, a Starbucks, a Chipotle, and a Burger King. The retail center sold for $34 million in 2024. To the north, the original Kirkbride building still stands. It is getting 360 new windows. The great lawn that Olmsted designed is being restored. Plans call for a $300 million mixed-use community on the site where 6,000 patients once lived. In 2021, Governor Hochul began adding back psychiatric beds in New York for the first time in decades. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the pendulum had swung too far in the other direction. There is a bell on the lawn of the museum maintained by the Hudson River State Hospital Nurses Alumni Association. It was cast from the shackles and chains that once restrained the mentally ill. It was placed there to mark the moment when those restraints were no longer needed, when society had found a better way. The story of Hudson River State Hospital is the story of a country that kept finding better ways and then forgetting them. A building designed to heal through beauty that became a warehouse for 6,000 people. A reformer who abolished restraints until the state sent him more patients than any building could hold. Pacifists who forced the country to look, and a country that looked away again the moment it got the chance. If this story changed how you think about what happens when a society builds something with the best intentions and then walks away from it, share that in the comments.